It's time to freak and it's time to scream. Get your cape if you know what I mean. Knuckle dusters and thick skin. Your time is about to begin. Time to begin. Time to begin. Time to begin.
So Double Dragon was an incredible success for Techno Japan, or is it Technos Japan? I never know. The game was really popular in arcades, and you know, kids and adults and people, general human beings, they couldn't put enough money into Double Dragon.
So Double Dragon was so popular that they decided, let's get this into the homes of people.
If you owned a Commodore 64 or
Commodore Amiga, or a Sega Master System, or a Nintendo, or a Commodore Amiga,
Or if you had a Sega Mega Drive,
or a box of breakfast cereal, or if you owned a Commodore 64, or a Nintendo machine,
or a Super Nintendo machine,
or if you had an Atari 2600,
or a Game Boy, or a Sega Game Gear.
or a Sega Mega Drive.
doesn't matter. Double Dragon was coming to it. And my friend had a Commodore 64. And when Steve Dart, my friend, and I first found Double Dragon, wow. I mean, we were hooked. We were convinced that this was the greatest thing that ever happened to us. So we just played the arcade wherever we could find it. And so Double Dragon was rolled out to all these different home computers and home gaming systems. And my friend Steve and I, we loved Double Dragon so much. And so we were just counting down the days until he had a version of it on his Commodore 64. And one time at school, he said to me, he said,
Damon, I've got Double Dragon coming on the weekends to the Commodore 64.
He actually didn't sound anything like that because he was an 11-year-old. But I said,
oh my god, really? Double Dragon?
Commodore 64? Now in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I've seen games on the 64 and I've seen what the Commodore 64 is capable of. And as much as I like the Commodore 64, I don't know if Double Dragon, the arcade game, is going to be much good on the Commodore 64. So from that point, you know, I was just dreaming about Double Dragon being on Steve's computer.
And so Steve rang me one Saturday morning.
He says, it's here.
So I practically left the house right then, ran all the way down the street to Steve's house, and we loaded up Double Dragon. Now, he didn't buy the game. It was a pirated game, so it was just a floppy disk that said Double Dragon on it. Someone's handwriting.
I thought, God, the developers could have done better than this, you know. They just don't care about home ports. They just get floppy disks and write Double Dragon and then throw them over someone's fence.
The thing about the Commodore 64, of course, is that you put the disc into the disc machine on a Saturday morning, and then at about 3.5 weeks later, it should be loaded and ready for you to play. So we put it in there, and we waited for a while, and of course the Commodore 64, you know, loading thing came up, all those lines, beautiful actually, and then it comes up with some music. Really great music, and we're like, oh my god, none of us could breathe. We were about to die because we were just anticipating this incredible experience. And then it starts loading again. And then Steve says, why don't we go outside and muck around for a bit? Spent a couple of hours out there, came in, Double Dragon still loading there.
Decided to go out again to the shop, went for a walk, came back, Double Dragon was still loading.
His family decided to go on a holiday for 3 weeks.
I went home, came back, Double Dragon was still loading.
Of course, by the time that it loaded, I had a full beard. It was fantastic.
You know, a 12-year-old boy can have a full beard. You just need to load a game in a Commodore 64 system. And that'll get your beard going. Because, of course, it takes that long.
So we walk inside. At this point, we're actually 35-year-old men. Double Dragon still hadn't loaded, but the title screen was there. And then we're thinking, here we go, this is amazing. Oh my god, you're going to be the blue guy. I'll be Spike, you can be Hammer. We've got our joysticks and we're waiting and waiting. And then it comes up, it starts. It was only one player on the Commodore 64. So we got over that, and then we saw the game start. And I have to say, I don't think in my life ever I have been as disappointed as I was at that point when I expected the splendor and the majesty of Double Dragon, the arcade game, to appear on my friend Steve's Commodore 64. It was the biggest disappointment of my life. The character is about yay big, and he resembles probably more like a turd compared to Spike or Billy Lee. You move the turd around the screen, and the biggest problem with this is that the characters that come up that you have to beat, they kick you before you can do anything. The only way you can perform any damage on an enemy at all would be to actually run in, kick them, and then run off. And so it becomes this sort of game of like running in, kicking someone, and backing off. So you're forever sort of just playing the game like this. And you do develop a rhythm, of course. And if you watch someone playing Double Dragon on a Commodore 64, it's a bit like tennis, because you're watching the character, go over and kick him. And the other thing is the characters, they have the life force of a stone. They just continue to exist. And when you finally kill one, another one just sort of appears.
Even today, people talk about it. I saw a guy broken down in the street the other day, just a human wreck, and he was up on the curb and crying and in tattered clothes. And I said, "Mate, are you okay?" And he said, "I just can't. I can't go on." I said, "Why? What's wrong?" And he said, "Just the Double Dragon Commodore 64 experience was too much." I said, "Buddy, I know this is really hard for all of us." And I said, "When did that happen again? 1988. Humans exist today as broken specimens because of the Double Dragon Commodore 64 port. It was an absolute stinking heap of crap. So the first Double Dragon port was by Melbourne House. Actually, I read an interview with the person who was working on it, and they had about 3 or 4 weeks to get this thing out. Because everything's money, right? It all comes down to money. People just want to get this out. Apparently Technos Japan, in Japan, didn't have anything to do with the porting process at all. So one of the creators that I saw in the interview said that they were just left to their own devices to sort of make this game. And it's very interesting because back then what happened is the company that was hiring them to do this port actually sent a Double Dragon cabinet to their office. So the guys at Melbourne House or whatever it was had this Double Dragon cab. The guy that did the interview, he'd never played Double Dragon in the arcade. Can you imagine not actually playing Double Dragon in the arcade in 1987? So he said that they played it, they loved it, and they had to, of course, make that arcade game appear on the Commodore 64. He said it was a very difficult thing because at that point they had to hand draw all the characters. So basically that's why Double Dragon on a lot of these home computers looks like it's been drawn by your great grandmother after she's passed. So you get these versions of Double Dragon characters. But then, every now and then you get a port of an arcade game like Bubble Bobble, for an example, that is just a shining example of what a home computer can do. And I think Double Dragon, they could have got close. We saw that with Street Fighter and other things they did down the track. But that was because later on in the piece, they learned how to actually capture the screen, the arcade screen. They could do a direct screen capture and then use those models and use that picture to actually do their own design. Like everything, technology gets better and better. So the Commodore 64 version was pretty bad. I have this machine here which I've sort of built, so I have all the Double Dragons on this. I load up the Commodore 64 one now and then, and I think, I'll have a play of that. That'll be great. Get ready, have a go, and then the first screen, and you're just like, this is, I can't.